Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to the reforms needed in the banking sector as observed by Deepak Parekh, the former chairman of the erstwhile Housing Development Finance Corporation. He has argued that the FDI limits can be raised in the banking sector, and also the banks should be allowed to choose where to lend rather than imposing stringent priority sector lending guidelines upon them. The second article is related to the productivity of the parliament, as the Lok Sabha Speaker Om Birla observed that the Lok Sabha achieved 75% success rate in the budget session by passing 9 out of the 12 bills tabled and therefore clocking 93% productivity, whereas the Rajya Sabha also witnessed 110% productivity in the budget session. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the prelims pointers which will be helpful for your prelims preparation. The first article is related to the reforms needed in the banking sector in India as observed by Deepak Parekh, the former chairman of the erstwhile Housing Development Finance Corporation. He has argued that the banks should be allowed to lend where they wish to, rather than imposing too stringent priority sector lending guidelines upon them. Similarly, the FDI needs to be further liberalized in the banking sector in India. Therefore, we'll discuss the significance of the banking sector for the Indian economy, the challenges faced by the banking sector, the steps taken by the government to introduce reforms in banking in India, and also a few suggestions in this regard. We'll focus upon the priority sector lending and the FDI liberalization for the banking sector in India. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development, and employment. First, let us analyze the structure of the banking system in India. At the top, there is the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, which functions as the Central Bank of India. Then there are certain scheduled banks and unscheduled banks. The scheduled banks are those banks which are included under the Schedule 2 of the RBI Act 1934. Therefore, they are regulated by RBI, plus they have to adhere to certain RBI guidelines, for example, maintaining a minimum paid up capital, maintaining certain reserves. And the scheduled commercial banks, they can be public sector banks, regional rural banks, or private sector banks in India. The public sector banks include the State Bank Group and the other nationalized banks. The nationalization of banks in India started in 1969 under the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's government. Then it was done in 1980. In 1980, 6 more banks were nationalized, including the Oriental Bank of Commerce, the Punjab and Sindh Bank, etc. Then there are regional rural banks. The regional rural banks, they have a joint ownership structure. That is, they are owned jointly by the Ministry of Finance, a sponsoring bank, and the state governments in the ratio of 50%, 35%, and 15%. That is, the Ministry of Finance owns 50% of the regional rural bank, and 35% share is owned by a sponsoring bank and 15% by the state governments. They were started from 1975 onwards to ensure that the credit availability through the formal channels, it is available in the rural areas also. They are also regulated by the RBI and they are supervised by NABARD. Then there are private sector banks. The private sector banks, they may be the domestic banks and they can be the foreign banks. The domestic private sector banks include the ICICI Bank, HDFC Bank. The foreign private sector banks are those banks which have bases abroad, but they have operations in India also. For example, Citibank, Standard Chartered Bank, etc. Then there are cooperative banks also apart from the commercial banks. The cooperative banks, they are functioning under the structure that the members of the cooperatives, they are depositing their money in the cooperative bank and they can withdraw the money in the form of loans from the cooperative bank whenever they need it. They are there at the state level in the form of state cooperative banks, at the central level as central cooperative banks, and the district level also as primary agriculture credit societies. Apart from this, there are certain other banks also, for example, development banks. The development banks, they usually give loans for long term, financing for the long term, for example, NABARD. the SIDBI, Small Industries Development Bank of India, IDBI, Industries Development Bank of India, they are development banks. Then there are differentiated banks also. The concept of differentiated banks was introduced by the RBI after the recommendation of the Nachiket More Committee. The differentiated banks, they can be small finance banks, they can be payment banks. These are also providing the financial services. For example, the payment banks like the Airtel Payment Bank, India Post Payment Bank, they are also providing mobile banking and financial services as well as the remittance services. Apart from this, there can be the non-banking financial companies also. They are not banks, rather they are registered as companies. The NBFCs, they are registered as companies under the Companies Act, although they are also providing financial services, but they are not banks. Now, what is the significance of the banking sector for the economy? The banks foremost are ensuring the availability of credit. The credit through the formal channels. For example, people who have surplus money, they deposit it in the banks, which leads to the growth in the deposits. But the deposit growth has almost plateaued over the past 3 or 4 years because of the availability of other investment options. For example, the household savings being channelized towards mutual funds, SIPs, other stock options, etc. And in turn, the banks also do not keep the money that they collect from the depositors in their pockets. They further lend it to someone, lending at a higher interest rate to the business entities, to the MSMEs for infrastructure creation, etc., which leads to economic activity and further GDP growth because of the creation of assets. And for example, in the agriculture sector itself, the agriculture credit in fiscal year 2021 was about 13 lakh crore rupees, whereas in fiscal year 2024 it was about 20 lakh crore rupees, leading to significant credit growth through the banking sector. Simultaneously, they are ensuring financial stability as well as good asset quality. For example, bringing down the non-performing assets. They are also ensuring the digital transformation as well as financial inclusion. For example, the usage of UPI, about 200 lakh crore rupees through the UPI transactions in fiscal year 2024 alone. Similarly, they help in the development of the capital market also. For example, through the issuance of the corporate bonds. There were about 80 main board IPOs which were listed in fiscal year 2025. And they help in the implementation of the welfare schemes as well. For example, through the opening of the accounts through Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana. And in Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, account holders also more than 50% are women, therefore ensuring the social inclusion as well. Similarly, the banking sector gives loans to the MSMEs also through the priority sector lending guidelines, therefore encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation. Now, when we look at the relative role of the public sector banks versus the private sector banks in the banking in India, the total assets owned by the public sector banks are more than the total assets owned by the private sector banks, but the growth rate in the private sector banks has been quite high. Now, let us discuss the guidelines related to the priority sector lending which are imposed upon the banks by the RBI. As per the RBI, the priority sector lending means the allocation of a specific portion of the adjusted net bank credit to the specific sectors of the economy. For example, certain amount of the total loans which are given by the banks, that has to be given towards the sectors which can include agriculture, MSME, export credit, education, housing, social infrastructure, renewable energy and certain other sectors. If the banks are not able to meet that minimum criteria, minimum percentage of the loans that they give are not given to the priority sector lending sectors, then they can buy the PSL certificates, the priority sector lending certificates from the other banks which have exceeded their target. If they are not able to buy the PSL certificates also, they will have to contribute the remaining portion of that mandate towards the Rural Infrastructure Development Fund. Again, from the RIDF also, the money will be further challenged towards the same sectors, the priority sector lending sectors. Now, the purpose behind this mechanism is to ensure that there is inclusive growth, to ensure that there is sufficient availability of credit to such sectors also. For example, for the agriculture sector, for the MSMEs, etc., there should be availability of credit through the formal channels, affordable credit, and to reduce the inequality as well. And the PSL has led to the growth in the lending towards these sectors by about 85% from 2019 to 2024. Let us also observe the evolution of the priority sector lending guidelines in India. First step was the nationalization of the banks, so that the nationalized banks, there the mandate can be enforced to ensure that there is lending towards the underserved sectors, for example in the rural areas especially. Then the approach was further given form through the Gedgil Committee recommendations in 1969, which advocated for the area approach, therefore pushing for the lead bank scheme, ultimately leading to the regional credit planning. Then it was finally formalized through the RBI's Informal Study Group Report 1971, after which the mandate was imposed. And the Krishnaswamy Committee in 1980 even recommended that 40% of the adjusted net bank credit must go towards the priority sector lending by the scheduled commercial banks. The adjusted net bank credit includes the total credit given by the commercial banks after adjusting for the deductibles, and sub targets should also be introduced for the agriculture sector and the weaker sections as well. Then in 2025, now the RBI has come up with new guidelines. What are the 2025 guidelines of the RBI? That the domestic commercial banks plus the large foreign banks are treated as those banks which are having more than 20 branches in India, although their base is abroad. They will be required to give 40% of their adjusted net bank credit or the credit equivalent of the off-balance sheet exposure towards the priority sector lending, whereas the foreign banks which are having less than 20 branches in India will also be required to give 40% of their adjusted net bank credit or the credit equivalent of the off-balance sheet exposure, whichever is higher, towards the PSL category sectors. But out of that, less than 32% can be for the export credit, remaining 8% has to be for the other PSL sectors. The regional rural banks and the small finance banks, they are having an even higher mandate, that 75% of their adjusted net bank credit or the credit equivalent of the off-balance sheet exposure, whichever is higher, has to be allocated towards the PSL category loans. Now, what is the significance of this? First, it ensures financial inclusion. It ensures the availability of credit for the underserved sectors. It ensures regional development also, because of the mandate towards giving loans towards agriculture or the MSMEs, ensuring that the credit is flowing towards the rural areas also. Plus, it will lead to the employment creation. For example, the MSME and agriculture, these two are the largest employment creators in India. Plus, therefore, they will promote entrepreneurship as well as innovation, and because the loans will go to the agriculture sector, it will lead to agriculture modernization, technology adoption in the agriculture, and therefore improving the productivity also in agriculture sector. But there are certain challenges with respect to the enforcement of the priority sector lending. The challenges include the increase in the NPAs. For example, the non-performing assets, they increase whenever there are vagaries due to the rainfall variations in monsoon, which leads to crop failures, which leads to the non-performing assets coming from the side of agriculture, even from the MSMEs also, and at times the loans which are forwarded without collaterals. Similarly, the compliance burden is heavy on the banks because they need to meet the targets of the priority sector lending, and at times it leads to the misallocation of resources as well, increasing the operational cost because of the higher amount of paperwork needed and also the monitoring required to ensure that the funds are going towards the priority sector lending. And also it leads to market concentration also, because within the priority sector lending also there are multiple available options. For example, they can give loans for the housing. Housing loans are included under the creation of social infrastructure, and it is considered as a safe category for the priority sector lending. So most of the banks which want to fulfill the priority sector lending categories criteria, they are giving the housing loans. Similarly, it is difficult to ensure credit assessment, especially for the micro enterprises and also for the small farmers. They do not follow the traditional credit assessment framework. That cannot be applied in this case. Now let's discuss the second part of the debate, whether we should liberalize the FDI in the banking sector in India. Currently, India allows the foreign shareholding of 20% for the public sector banks, whereas for the private sector banks it is 74%. And the government is considering increasing the foreign ownership limit for the state-owned banks also to 49%. Now, what will be the benefit of increasing the FDI limit for the banking sector? First, it will ensure the access to the long-term capital, because we have already observed the trend that the loan growth in India, that is more than the deposit growth. The deposit mobilization has been lagging for the banking sector, because we have seen that the household savings, they are now being channelized to the alternative investment options also. For example, sending it to the mutual funds, stocks, etc. Therefore, we need capital. And if the foreign equity comes in through the higher FDI limit, it will lead to the availability of capital at a lower cost and also expand the lending, while at the same time maintaining adequate capital for adhering to the CAR norms, the capital adequacy norms also. And therefore, they will also bring in better governance standards. For example, they will bring better risk management practices. The foreign ownership will also bring in experience in the compliance, treasury operations, technology, cross-border banking, etc. This will lead to better valuation for the banking sector stocks, as it will increase the market liquidity. And if there is global visibility also, then the Indian banking stocks, they will also get representation in the global indices as well. Plus, it will lead to consolidation also, because more capital will come in and therefore there will be support for the weaker banks as well. But there are certain challenges in liberalizing the FDI for the banking sector. First, there is a fear that it will ensure there may be an external influence over the domestic credit allocation. For example, we need adherence to the priority sector lending, and the banking sector will be exposed to the volatility of the global capital flows. And therefore, there will be complexity in the regulatory procedures also. For example, the ownership thresholds, they need to be tracked, the voting rights, the effective control of the governance of the management of the bank, that also needs to be tracked. At the same time, whether they are in line with India's objectives of maintaining financial stability plus the development objectives, that also needs to be ensured by the regulator. Now, what are the other challenges that the banking sector faces? First, there is the challenge of the NPAs. Although the NPAs have been coming down, for example, in March 2021, the NPAs were close to 9%. They have been brought to just about 2.5% as of March 2025. Similarly, there are concerns regarding the low capital adequacy. They need to adhere to the CAR norms, they need to adhere to the Basel III norms. For that, they need sufficient capital, and they have been demanding capital through the recapitalization from the government. There are governance issues as well. For example, political interference in the functioning, limited autonomy in the banking sector, especially for the public sector banks. Also, there is dependence upon the government for the recapitalization. For example, between 2016 to 2021, about 3 lakh crore rupees were spent by the government for the recapitalization of the public sector banks. Also, there is a low credit to GDP ratio in the Indian economy. The bank credit that the banks give to the commercial sector in India, that is just about 50% of India's GDP. Whereas in the advanced economies, even in China, etc., the ratio is closer to 100%. That is, the credits to the commercial sector by the banks, that is closer to 100% of the country's GDP. Similarly, there are sectoral credit gaps also. For example, within the private sector lending also, the banks preferring the safest categories, for example, going for housing loans, going for social infrastructure, rather than giving more loans to the agriculture sector. Also, there are cyber security related risks also, for example, hacking, etc. And then there are certain issues observed in the implementation of the 7 pillars of Indradhanush also. The government came up with a comprehensive plan of Indradhanush, through which a bank board bureau was to be set up. That was also to ensure that the appointments in the banking sector for the top positions, that is transparent, the capitalization also, but the funding has been inadequate in view of the surge in the NPAs in the past. The de-stressing was one of the major objectives of Indradhanush, but despite that, there have been problems in settling of the bad debt on part of the banks. Now, let's discuss the initiatives taken by the government to introduce reforms in the banking sector. First, there was the Indradhanush plan and the formation of the bank board bureau that we already discussed, and then there was a recapitalization of the banks. The recapitalization to ensure they have enough capital for the maintaining of the capital adequacy ratio, plus the adherence to the Basel norms. The Basel norms have also evolved. The Basel I norms required the maintenance of the capital capital adequacy ratio to 8%, 8% of the risk weighted assets, plus the tier 1 capital of more than 4%. The tier 1 capital includes the statutory reserves plus the paid up capital. Then the Basel II norms required the capital adequacy ratio also and the supervisory review, ensuring that not only the credit risk which is taken into account, but also the market risk plus the operational risk, they are also taken into account, ensuring therefore market discipline as well. And the Basel III norms further required that the total tier 1 and the tier 2 assets that should be more than 10.5% of its risk weighted assets. The tier 2 capital includes the undisclosed reserves plus the preference shares, etc. Then there are further initiatives, for example, the amalgamation of the public sector banks. For example, the mergers and acquisitions, merger of the Bharatiya Mahila Bank with the State Bank of India. The mergers, therefore, ensuring that there is economy of scale that can be utilized, there is better efficiency, there is reduction of the redundancies. For example, if both the banks have two branches at the same place, then one of the branches can be closed, as the customers for both the branches can come to the same bank if both the banks are merged, therefore reducing the redundancies. At the same time, there was the holding of the Gyan Sangams, that is to discuss the governance reforms for the banking sector, the adopting of the insolvency and bankruptcy code, therefore ensuring that the promoters or the owners of the defaulting companies, they are not able to take control of the defaulting company, and ensuring that the willful defaulters, they are not able to participate in the resolution proceedings. Similarly, the formation of the National Asset Reconstruction Company, that was planned to take over the large loans, 15 large loans of 50,000 crore rupees, the NPAs, for which they will go for the recovery, whereas the banks, they will rather focus upon their core activity, that is lending. Similarly, the digital banking initiatives, for example, the introduction of UPI, e-rupee, the QR based e-voucher, etc. Similarly, the adoption of the SARFAESI Act, the DRT's reforms and the prudential framework, the DRT's debt recovery tribunals, their limits being increased from 10 lakh to 20 lakh, etc. Now let's also observe the recommendations of a few committees for introducing the reforms in the banking sector in India. There was the Narasimhan Committee 1, which recommended that the SLR requirements, the statutory liquidity ratio and the cash reserve ratio, these should be reduced, the government interference should be minimized, and there should be the establishment of an asset reconstruction fund. Similarly, the Narasimhan Committee 2 in 1998 proposed that there should be structural reforms, reducing further the SLR, also introduction of the prudential norms, and ensuring that the international accounting standards are adopted. The PJ Nayak Committee further recommended that the stake of the government should be reduced, to below 50% in the public sector banks also, and the establishment of a bank investment company should take place. This bank investment company should take over the governance of the banks. First, it should be under the Bank Board Bureau, then the bank investment company should take over. Then regarding the governance also, it recommended that we can split the positions of CMD, the chairman and managing director. These positions should be split, plus there should be a fixed tenure of 5 years. The Nachiket More Committee recommended the establishment of the payment banks and the universal electronic bank account, etc. The HR Khan Committee recommended for the inflation targeting and the monetary policy transmission, therefore which led to ultimately the 4 plus minus 2% target for inflation also, and the 4R framework, that is recognition, recapitalization, resolution, and introducing reforms for the long run in the banking sector. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for the banking sector? First, regarding the governance and autonomy, we can follow the recommendations of PJ Nayak Committee. For example, bringing down the stake of the government to less than 50%, going for privatization and consolidation. The support is required for the weaker banks and consolidation is required for the stronger banks. Credit flow should happen to the MSMEs, because as per the Parliamentary Standing Committee report itself, the MSMEs have an unmet credit need of about 25 trillion rupees. Technology adoption and innovation should happen so that the banks are able to adopt the artificial intelligence and come up with new innovative products for the customers. The bond market needs to be expanded so that the large corporations, they are encouraged to take money by raising bonds by issuing bonds rather than borrowing large amounts of money from the commercial banks. Similarly, the niche banking and development finance banks, the DFIs can be promoted, the developmental financial institutions which can provide for long-term loans, and the lazy banking should be discouraged. Lazy banking means, for example, within the priority sector lending also, the banks focus upon the safest criterias, or the banks giving loans to the large corporations rather than spreading out their loans. There is a mains practice question also that discuss the need for reforms in the banking sector with special reference to the priority sector lending and opening up FDI in the banks. Suggest measures to improve efficiency, inclusiveness and global competitiveness. Please try to write it. The next article is related to parliamentary productivity. The context behind it is that the Lok Sabha Speaker Om Birla observed that the Lok Sabha in the budget session had a success rate of 75%. As 9 out of 12 bills which were tabled in the Lok Sabha in the budget session were passed, and it clocked about 93% productivity, whereas the Rajya Sabha witnessed more than 100% productivity in the budget session. So we will discuss a few facts regarding the parliamentary productivity, the reasons behind decline of the parliamentary productivity over time, the consequences of low parliamentary productivity, and the reforms needed to ensure a high productivity. This is important in GS2 under the topic Parliament and State Legislature, Structure, Functioning, Conduct of Business, Powers and Privileges and Issues arising out of these. First, let us start with some facts regarding the parliamentary productivity. Over time, it has been decreasing. If you observe the average number of annual sitting days witnessed by the Lok Sabha, from the first Lok Sabha onwards, it has been decreasing, although not continuously, but broadly, there has been a declining trend. And in the monsoon session 2025, there was a productivity of the Lok Sabha at 29%, and in the Rajya Sabha it was just about 34%. Similarly, in the question hour also, just 23% of the questions were answered in Lok Sabha and 6% in the Rajya Sabha. Whereas in 17th Lok Sabha from 2019 to 2024, as per the PRS legislative research data, the productivity was just about 47%. And the annual sittings from 1952 to 1970, that was on an average about 121 days, whereas from 2000 onwards, the annual sittings have reduced to just about 68 days, almost half of that time. In the 16th and 17th Lok Sabha, just about 20% of the bills were referred to the parliamentary standing committees, whereas as per the PRS data, in the 17th Lok Sabha, about 35% of the bills had just less than 1 hour of the discussion in the parliament, therefore pointing out that the bills are being passed in the parliament without adequate discussion. And there has been no deputy speaker also in the last Lok Sabha, and the opposition business accounts for less than 10% of the house time, the session time, whereas if you observe in the other democracies, for example in UK, it is more than twice. In the UK, the opposition business has a time of 20 to 25% of the total parliamentary functioning time. And in India, as per the PRS data, since 1970, not even a single private member's bill has been passed since 1970. And the number of ordinances have increased over the years. From 2000 to 2010, 6 ordinances were passed per year. From 2014 to 2023, 12 ordinances have been passed per year. Similarly, the delegated legislation has increased 4 times. Therefore, the role of the parliament in terms of legislation has also been brought down. And the budget discussion time has also been continuously decreasing. For example, earlier it used to be close to 35 hours. Now it has come down to less than 15 hours, even the budget discussion. Similarly, in 2021-2022, 76%, more than 75% of the demand for grants were passed without any discussion. Now, what are the reasons behind such low parliamentary productivity? First, there has been a trend that there has been executive dominance in the lawmaking. For example, the lawmaking has been led by the Prime Minister's office from the top itself, which has diminished the role of the parliament. And more than 90% of the bills, they have been driven by the government. At the same time, the opposition has gotten limited time in the session of the parliament. Because it gets limited time, therefore it uses the parliamentary disruptions as a protest tool. They see it as the only method, that disruption will be the only method they will somehow get to say something, and which leads to adverse impact on the productivity. For example, raising issues like the Citizenship Amendment Act, CA, NRC issue, the Hindenburg issue, etc., and the opposition uses this to create political disruptions in the parliament. Similarly, even the speaker's rulings have also been partitioned. There have been allegations that they have been partitioned. For example, there have been more than 150 suspensions of the members of parliament in 2023. Also, the roles of the parliamentary committees has been diminished, as just about 20% of the bills were referred in the 16th and the 17th Lok Sabha to the parliamentary standing committees. Therefore, there is lesser debate, there is lesser scrutiny regarding the bills. Now, what are the consequences of low parliamentary productivity? First, it will lead to poor accountability, because the parliament will be sitting for lesser time. Fewer sittings will lead to lesser scrutiny of the bills, and the number of questions which will be answered in the question hour, that will also come down. For example, just 23% in Lok Sabha, and in the Rajya Sabha even lower at just about 6%. And the legislation quality therefore will be adversely impacted, because if the bills are passed without adequate debate, then the provisions of the bill, they will not be scrutinized in detail, which will adversely impact the quality of the legislation. Similarly, it may lead to a distrust of the public, because if there are frequent disruptions, only the creation of the din in the parliament rather than useful debates, then the public will lose the trust, and therefore the parliament's ineffectiveness, that will show the apathy of the members of the parliament, and the public will be disillusioned. And it may even lead to silencing of the voices, because it will lead to ultimately centralized lawmaking. If there are minimal debates, only the government will be pushing through the bills, and there will be no passing of the private members bill, which anyway have not been passed since 1970 onwards. And also, if the parliament does not function for an adequate period of time, there may not be the passing of legislations themselves. And if the legislations on the critical areas are not passed, then the judiciary needs to step in at times, and which will lead to the judicial legislation, whereas the judiciary has the mandate of the interpretation of the laws. And if it is forced to overstep its mandate, that is also going against the concept of the separation of powers. Therefore, the judiciary will have to fill the vacuum, the legislative vacuum, if the parliament does not function. Now, what are the reforms which are needed for improving the parliamentary productivity? First, we need to have a greater scrutiny of the proposed legislations. For example, sending the bills for the committees. We can put in place a committee system. We can mandate that 75% of the bills need to be mandatorily referred to the parliamentary standing committees. Or we can even explore sending the bills for the public consultations, getting expert opinions on the legislative proposals before introducing in the parliament. Similarly, we can limit the issuance of the whips. Whips can be issued in case there is anti-defection fear, or only for the confidence motions or the money bills. As per the recommendation of the Law Commission 170th report also, that the issuance of the whips can be limited to if the no confidence motion proposal is there, or if there is the money bill. Or the MP's autonomy, the members of the parliament, they should have sufficient autonomy, in line with what happens in the UK also, the UK parliamentary conventions. Similarly, we can go for a consensus based approach. Rather than bulldozing the bills through by using the brute majority in the parliament, we can try to build a consensus. And for that, we can put in place an institutional dialogue. For example, going for structured meetings, periodic meetings of the speaker, the leader of the house, the prime minister, leader of opposition, etc. And we can define certain number of days as opposition days, which happens in the case of UK also. Similarly, we can introduce a minimum number of sitting days as the guaranteed sitting days where the parliament has to function, and we can put in place a statutory minimum requirement of 100 to 120 days. For example, it happens in Australia as well. And we can also introduce other ethical practices, best practices, by learning from the other countries, by sending the MPs and MLAs through exchange programs, by introducing therefore the procedural best practices as well as the ethical best practices that they will learn through such exchange programs. There is a mains practice question also. Examine the reasons for low productivity of the parliament, discuss its consequences on governance and accountability, and suggest measures to enhance the effectiveness of the parliamentary functioning. Please try to write it. The next article is related to Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. The phase 3 of the Gram Sadak Yojana has been extended now. This is important in prelims under the topic economic and social development. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few facts regarding the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. It was launched in 2000 as a central sector scheme. After the recommendation of the 14th Finance Commission, the funding is shared between the centre and the states in the ratio of 60:40 for the plain areas. The objective of the Gram Sadak Yojana is to build all-weather roads. All-weather roads for ensuring interconnection in the rural areas. It also includes upgrading of the existing thorough routes and the major rural links to connect the habitations to the Gramin agriculture markets, higher secondary schools and hospitals. Now, which areas are eligible for the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana? The criteria is primarily focused upon the population and the connectivity status. The area has to be unconnected for it to be covered under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. In the plain areas, if it is unconnected and the habitation has more than 500 population, then it can be covered under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. For the northeastern states and the Himalayan states, if the population is more than 250, as per the 2001 census and it is not connected, then it will be covered under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. And for the tribal areas, Schedule 5 areas which are unconnected, there also if the population is more than 250, they will also be covered and the connectivity will be built. For the left-wing extremism affected blocks, just a population of 100 is required for it to be connected under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. Now, the Gram Sadak Yojana has had 3 phases so far. In the first phase, it was launched in 2000 as a 100% centrally sponsored scheme, and it was for connecting 1,35,436 habitations and upgrading of 3.68 lakh kilometer of the rural roads. And 40% of the renewal of the rural roads was funded by the states. In the phase 2 of the Gram Sadak Yojana, which was launched from 2013 onwards, the funding was shared in the ratio of 75:25 between the center and the states. For the hilly states, desert areas and the Schedule 5 areas and also the left-wing extremism areas, the center bore 90% of the expenditure, and it also involved upgrading of the existing roads of 50,000 kilometers. In the phase 3 of the Gram Sadak Yojana, it started from 2019 onwards. It was supposed to extend till 2024-25, and the center state funding ratio was to be 60:40 for the plain areas. For the northeast and Himalayan state, it was to be 90:10, and it was focused upon the rural infrastructure enhancement and ensuring therefore socio-economic development. Now, what is the significance of the Gram Sadak Yojana? First, it ensures socio-economic access, because it will ensure that the farm incomes will increase. How? Because if the unconnected habitations are connected to the Gramin agriculture markets, they will be able to transport their farm produce, they will be able to sell it, therefore their incomes will increase. At the same time, it will increase the employment also, because they are getting connectivity to the higher secondary schools, therefore better education levels, better literacy levels, better skill levels, therefore their employability will also increase, their incomes and employment both will increase. Similarly, it is filling the gaps in the rural infrastructure, because historically the rural road development, that was the responsibility of the state governments, but they neglected it because there were limited funds in the hands of the state governments, and also their planning priorities, they also neglected the rural infrastructure. Therefore, now that gap in the rural infrastructure, that is being filled by the Gram Sadak Yojana. Similarly, it ensures the access to the essential services, for example, access to healthcare, access to education, and therefore it may even attract the industries also to the rural areas, not only to the tier 2, tier 3 towns, rather to the rural areas also. If there is connectivity, the industries will be attracted. Similarly, it will ensure the rural service delivery also. For example, if there is sufficient connectivity, easy connectivity, then it motivates the government personnel in various departments to work in the rural areas, for example, the healthcare workers, teachers, agriculture extension workers, etc. Now coming to the article, the central government has decided to extend the Gram Sadak Yojana phase 3 beyond March 2025 till the 2028-2029 with an increase in the budgetary outlay also by 3,700 crore rupees to 83,977 crore rupees. Now the new proposal also involves the consolidation of through routes and the major rural links connecting habitations to the Gramin agriculture markets, higher secondary schools and hospitals. The first phase we already observed was launched in 2000, second phase in 2013. Then after these two phases, another component of the Gram Sadak Yojana was road connectivity project for the left-wing extremism affected areas, which was launched in 2016 for constructing the rural roads in the left-wing extremism areas, and then the third phase was launched in 2019. The next article is related to the National Medical Commission. As the National Medical Commission has proposed to ease the norms for establishing new medical colleges in India. This is important in prelims under the topic current events of national and international importance. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few facts regarding the National Medical Commission. It is a statutory body established under the National Medical Commission Act of 2019. It replaced the earlier Medical Council of India. What does it do? It regulates the medical education and the medical professionals in India, the doctors, etc., and it recognizes their medical qualifications, the degrees, and it also provides the accreditation to the medical schools, and it also ensures a registration for the medical practitioners and monitors the medical practice also. It also assesses the medical infrastructure in India, thereby determining what is the need, what are the gaps in the medical infrastructure. It is headquartered in New Delhi. Now, what are the core functions of the National Medical Commission? First, it frames the policies for setting the qualities, setting the standards in the medical education, and thereby lays down the regulations for the same. It also frames the policies for regulating the institutions, for regulating the medical research in India as well. The guidelines are laid by it. It also assesses the requirements in the healthcare infrastructure, including the requirement for infrastructure and also the requirement for the human resources in the medical profession, and it therefore also ensures the compliance by the state medical councils in this regard. It also enjoys an appellate jurisdiction with respect to the decisions of the autonomous boards in the medical profession, and it also prepares the codes for the professional ethics for the medical profession. Now, what is its composition? It comprises of 33 members, including the chairperson, who can be medical professionals only, 10 ex officio members and 22 part-time members. It also has a medical advisory council. The Medical Advisory Council also functions as a platform for the states and union territories to put forward their views and concerns before the National Medical Commission, and also the NMC is advised by the Medical Advisory Council on the measures for the minimum standards of medical education. There are 4 autonomous boards also which are part of it: the Undergraduate Medical Education Board, the Post-Graduation Medical Education Board, and the Medical Assessment and Ratings Board, and also the Ethics and Medical Registration Board. Now coming to the article, the NMC has proposed draft amendments to the 2023 regulations for easing the norms for establishment of medical colleges, allowing in more trusts and societies as well. Now, it is also looking at tightening of the postgraduate medical education standards and introducing a single state license for the armed forces medical services doctors to practice nationwide. It will therefore ensure the control over the quality of education while simultaneously streamlining the process for setting up the institutions, medical institutions, establishing new medical colleges, and regulating the military medical professional as well. It proposed the easing of the transfer related paperwork by allowing the Armed Forces Medical Services doctors to register once with a state medical council at the commissioning, with license valid nationwide during the active service. The retired doctors, they will need to re-register in their state of practice. The annual renewal of license will be centrally managed so that the licenses will not go inactive due to the delayed renewals or delays in the individual filing of the renewals. For more stringent standardization in the PG medical education, the Commission has asked all the medical colleges to adhere to updated infrastructure, faculty and clinical facilities criteria, with standalone PG institutes required to have 220 beds with at least 80% bed occupancy, and a revised senior faculty to student ratio of 1:2, and limiting the non-government colleges to a maximum of 4 seats when starting a new PG course or increasing the intake. The next article is related to the Banerghatta Biological Park. This is important in prelims under the topic General Issues on Environmental Ecology, Biodiversity and Climate Change. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few facts regarding the Banerghatta Biological Park and the Banerghatta National Park. The Banerghatta Biological Park is an integral part of the Banerghatta National Park. It was established independently in 2002 to meet the growing demand for eco-recreation, eco-tourism and conservation. So 545 hectares of forest area was carved out of the national park for the biological park. Later it was extended to 731.88 hectares, and it lies south of the Bangalore city. It has different units in it, including a zoo, a safari, a butterfly park and a rescue center, which functions for the conservation of the captive animals. It is the first biological park in India to have a fenced forested elephant sanctuary as well. Let's also discuss a few facts regarding the Banerghatta National Park. It was declared a national park in 1974, whereas the Banerghatta Biological Park was established in 2002. It is near the Anekal Hill Range near Bangalore, and in 2006 India's first butterfly enclosure was established there. A river passes through it. The Swarnmukhi stream passes through the national park, and it has 3 kinds of vegetation: the dry deciduous scrub forest, southern tropical dry deciduous forest and the southern tropical moist mixed forest also are found in the Banerghatta National Park. Now, what are the flora found here? It includes sandalwood, neem, tamarind, bamboo and eucalyptus, whereas the fauna found here include the Asian elephant, Indian goat, tiger, sambar deer, spotted deer, leopard, wild dog, wild pig, sloth bear, common mongoose, pangolin and slender loris. Now coming to the article, Bangaluru's Banerghatta Biological Park has announced the arrival of 4 cheetahs, including 2 females from South Africa. We have imported them from the Induna Primate and Parrot Park in South Africa, and it is under an approved animal exchange program in accordance with the Wildlife Protection Act, and it is to strengthen the conservation efforts, enhance genetic diversity within the captive populations, promote visitor awareness and support scientific research, therefore ensuring biodiversity in India. The next article is related to the nuclear power FDI policy. This is important for prelims under the topic economic and social development, particularly sustainable development. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few aspects of the Shanti Act. The Shanti Act allows the entry of the private players in the nuclear power sector. It allows for setting up of the nuclear power plants, owning of nuclear power plants and the operating of the nuclear power plants by the private entities, even the fabrication of the nuclear fuel by the private entities and the import and export of the nuclear fuel as well. Although for them to function, prior license have to be taken from the government of India, and no company will be given a license to operate if it is owned, controlled or dominated by entities which are deemed to be inimical or damaging to the defense of India, national security of India or the health and safety of the public. Therefore, the foreign owned Indian companies can also apply, but the FDI in the atomic energy is prohibited. And the nuclear power sector, we know that it is very capital intensive, and the mining of uranium and thorium, though, they will remain within the exclusive domain of the government and the government companies only. There the private players will not be allowed in the mining of the uranium and thorium. The Shanti Act also provides for the liability framework. It revises it. It provides for a strict no-fault liability regime for the operators of the nuclear power plants, for example, and it is in line with the liability framework under the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act. But the operators under the Shanti Act do not have any statutory right of recourse against the suppliers of the equipments and services, thereby essentially shielding or protecting the foreign suppliers of the nuclear equipments, and it increases therefore the contractual autonomy of the parties. the parties, that is the operators of the nuclear power plants and the suppliers of the power plant equipment, they can enter into a contract and accordingly decide the terms. And different caps are placed on the operator liability for a nuclear incident, and it depends upon the category of the nuclear installation, the capacity of the nuclear installation. That is, a larger capacity nuclear installation may have a larger liability cap, and the nuclear liability fund will also be established from which compensation will be provided in case there is a nuclear accident. The Shanti Act also seeks to ensure financial security of the private operators and insurance that they should have. It provides that all licensees which get the license from the Government of India for operating the nuclear power plants, for example, they must maintain sufficient financial security. That is, they must maintain it to ensure that they are able to safely dispose of radioactive substances, and they can settle the claims in case there is a damage, in case there is a nuclear incident. Also, the operator has to maintain either insurance or financial security therefore. Now coming to the article, the dilution of the liability clause under the proposed Shanti Act is expected to boost the FDI in India's nuclear power sector, as it opens up the private participation as well. The Atomic Energy Commission has approved an FDI policy which has now been sent for the interministerial consultation. Also, achieving the target of 100 gigawatt of nuclear power capacity by 2047 would require investments of at least 20 lakh crore rupees, assuming a baseline cost of 22 crore rupees per megawatt. Therefore, we need the FDI in the nuclear power sector also. The next article is related to adjournment sine die and various procedures for discussion in the Lok Sabha. As the extended budget session of the parliament was adjourned sine die after the opposition blocked the 131st constitutional amendment bill as it sought to link the women's reservation with the delimitation exercise. This is important in prelims under the topic Indian polity and governance, constitution and political system. So what are the procedures for holding discussions in the Lok Sabha? It can be either through a debate without voting under Rule 193, or as a motion with a vote under Rule 184, or through an adjournment motion or a no confidence motion. Let us discuss these one by one. First, the short duration discussion under Rule 193. It is done in Rajya Sabha under Rule 176. It is done for the matters which are urgent matters of public importance, and for a specified duration of discussion is required, and these issues are time sensitive issues, therefore they need to be taken up immediately. The procedure for introducing it is that the member of parliament gives a notice to the speaker specifying what is the matter and specifying the reasons as well as the urgency. The speaker has the authority to decide whether this issue qualifies for a short duration discussion or not. And at the end, the minister in charge responds to the discussion, and it is not followed by a motion. It is not followed by any voting after the discussion. Then another procedure for discussion is through Rule 184, whereby a motion is introduced with a vote also. This is similar to Rule 193, but here there is one exception. The issue which is raised in the form of a motion, that is, after the minister gives a reply, there is a voting which is done by the House. Another procedure for discussion is through the adjournment motion. It involves the matters which are having urgent public importance. It can be introduced for a definite matter which requires urgent public attention with the speaker's consent. Now, it is not there in the Rajya Sabha rule book, therefore the Rajya Sabha MPs, they use the rule 267 to suspend the question hour to raise the urgent matters. Now, what is the procedure for the adjournment motion? A notice has to be given by the member of parliament who wishes to introduce it before 10 AM on that day of the sitting, and if it is accepted, then the House adjourns after the voting. The adoption of the adjournment motion is seen as a censure of the government, although it is not compulsory for the government to resign if the adjournment motion is passed. Then another procedure for discussion is the no confidence motion. This is moved against the entire Council of Ministers. For this also, the notice has to be given before 10 AM on the day of the sitting of the Lok Sabha, and if according to the member of the parliament, the government actions are not satisfactory, and if he is demanding for the resignation of the government, then the no confidence motion is introduced. But for its introduction, the support of at least 50 members of the parliament is required. And if it is introduced, then a debate is taken up. After that, the House votes on it, and if it is adopted, then the government has to resign. Thank you.